Today's Q&A is about fatty acids, and the question is that a mashgiach told me that something needs hashgacha because it has fatty acids. Well, what's that? What are fatty acids, and can they really be treif? So most people think that when they think of oil, they think of something used in cooking, but food scientists realized they could do something. They could take oil or fat, and they could break it apart into its constituent parts and use those different parts for other purposes. So one of the things that they get from oils and fats is called fatty acids, and they're called that because they come from a fat or an oil. That's the fat word, and they have a certain structure called a carboxyl group that chemically that makes them be considered an acid. So they're called fatty acids. They're in chemistry they would be called acids. They come from a fat, so they're called fatty acids. Now, the carboxyl group is there in every fatty acid. So, and it's always attached to a chain of carbon atoms. So the difference between one fatty acid and the next has to do with how many carbons are in that chain, how long the chain is. So fatty acids, that have between 6 and 14 carbons in them, as a rule, they will come from sources that are inherently kosher, such as coconut or palm or vegetable oil. But the reason why they need hashgacha is because the equipment that's used to split the acid from the oil, to segregate one fatty acid from the next, to purify the fatty acids, all those different pieces of equipment could also be used to do the exact same process for fatty acids made from animal fat. Of course, animal fat is considered to be not kosher. In the world, it's not kosher, and therefore, if you use the same equipment to process animal fat as the vegetable oil, the fatty acids made from vegetable oil would be not kosher. Now, one use for the fatty acids, with these, what we call the medium length carbon chains, is to make flavors. Like, for example, hexanoic, or otherwise known as caproic acid, is a fatty acid with 6 carbons. That's why it's called hexanoic. And when it's reacted with ethyl alcohol, it produces something called ethyl caproate, and that has an apple-like flavor. So if you wanted to make an apple flavor, a company might put in ethyl caproate to make it have that specific taste. Now, those are for the fatty acids with a carbon chain that's what we call a medium length between 6 and 14. But if it has, a longer length, would be 16 or 18 carbons, those fatty acids called palmitic acid, stearic acid, or oleic acid, those are much more kosher sensitive, and that's because those can very well be made from actual animal fat, which would of course be not kosher. Now, they could also be used for flavors. Like, for example, palmitic acid could become ethyl palmitate, and it makes buttery or vanilla flavors. Or oleic acid could be used to make meat or chicken type flavors. That's one type of use you'd use with these fatty acids. Another one, which many people have probably seen if you look at your read packaging, is magnesium stearate, made with stearic acid. And that's added to pills or tablets because it helps them slide in and out of the machinery. Usually, it happens to be the magnesium stearate is in tiny amounts at about the bashishim, so you don't have to worry about that. But I'm just giving you as an example of what you might do with it. Now, talking about being bata bashishim, flavor chemicals, like the ones I've mentioned, are also used in tiny amounts, which theoretically they would be bata bashishim. However, since they have a very big effect on the taste, they're considered avida l'taima. They cannot be bata even though they're in tiny amounts. So if somebody used oleic acid made from animal fat, and they made a chicken flavor, I mentioned you can make the chicken flavor out of that, and use that in instant noodle soup, that soup would be usher even b'di'evet, since the flavor that was in there that was avida l'taima. Now, an important limitation to this rule of avida l'taima is that we only worry about avida l'taima when the food is inherently not kosher. But if it inherently is kosher, but it might be made on treif kalim, then it doesn't make it. Then it doesn't. It can be batal even if it's avida l'taima. This is called a concept called melech hablu midam. So, for example, if you took a fatty acid from the early group I mentioned about that has between 6 and 14 carbons, where we know comes from a kosher source, just the question is it might have been made on treif kalim. If that was used to make a flavor, b'di'evet, it would be batal because it would be batal b'shishim, and we would not treat it as an avida l'taima. Okay, now, another important way that fatty acids are used is to make something called polysorbates. They serve as emulsifiers. An emulsifier means it helps mix things mix together that wouldn't otherwise do so. So, an emulsifier, for example, to help water and oil mix together. The way you make a polysorbate is you react an ethoxylated sorbitan, that's on the binds with water, together with a fatty acid, which binds with the oil, and makes this thing called a polysorbate, which now helps the water and the oil bind together, like, for example, in a salad dressing. Now, the polysorbates, they're given numbers, and the number has to do with which fatty acid, which acid it uses. So the three common ones are polysorbate 20, made with lauric acid, polysorbate 60, made with stearic acid, and polysorbate 80, made with oleic acid. As a rule, emulsifiers do a role that makes them also not be able to be bottled. They're usually a davar hamaimid. They give the form to the food, and therefore they can't be bottled. However, just like I said before about avida l'taima, that strict status of not being bottled because it's davar hamaimid is only true when it's inherently usher, like in polysorbate 60 or 80, which are made of stearic acid or oleic acid, which come from actual animal fat. Polysorbate 20, made with lauric acid, which almost always comes from vegetable oil, it would not have the strict status of being a davar hamaimid because of not being able to because of davar hamaimid, because it's inherently kosher, just a kelim issue. Now, everything I've been talking about for the past couple of minutes, Matt Bittel, is of course relevant only for cases of the Evid. When we give hashgacha and when we look to eat food, we of course always look things to be kosher lechatchila, that there should be 100% kosher without any shaylos.